Alexander Hayes stared at the glowing screen of his laptop, the numbers and graphs all blending together after hours of reviewing quarterly reports. Outside his office window, the New York skyline sparkled against the darkening sky, but he barely noticed it anymore. The view from the 87th floor had lost its magic years ago, becoming just another backdrop to endless meetings and business calls. "Mr. Hayes?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The board members are asking if you'll be joining them for dinner." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. At 52, he looked older than his years. The weight of building a tech empire etched into the lines around his eyes. "Tell them I have another commitment," he replied, though his calendar was empty for the rest of the evening. The thought of another business dinner, with forced smiles and talk of market projections, made him feel hollow inside. When his assistant left, Alexander loosened his tie and walked to the window. $43 billion. That was what the financial magazine said he was worth this week. $43 billion. And yet he couldn't remember the last time he had felt anything close to happiness. The board meeting earlier that day had been particularly difficult. His decision to shut down 3 underperforming divisions meant over 2,000 employees would lose their jobs. His team had presented it as necessary restructuring, but the numbers on those spreadsheets represented real people with families and bills to pay. "It's just business," one board member had said with a shrug, as they voted unanimously to proceed with the cuts. Alexander grabbed his coat and headed for the private elevator. His driver would be waiting downstairs, as always, ready to take him back to his empty penthouse apartment. But tonight something inside him rebelled against the routine. "I'll find my own way home tonight, Paul," he told his surprised driver when he reached the lobby. "Take the evening off. Are you sure, sir?" Paul asked, concern evident in his voice. In 8 years of employment, Alexander had never dismissed him early. "Completely sure. Go spend some time with your family." The crisp autumn air hit Alexander's face as he stepped out onto the street without a clear destination in mind. He walked several blocks before realizing he'd left his designer overcoat unbuttoned, his expensive suit visible to anyone who might recognize him. On impulse, he ducked into a small shop and purchased a plain gray hoodie and a baseball cap with the New York Yankees logo. In the shop's small changing room, he removed his suit jacket and tie, putting on the hoodie and cap. Looking in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Without the trappings of wealth, he looked like any other middle-aged man on the streets of New York. There was something freeing about that anonymity. He continued walking without purpose, eventually finding himself near Grand Central Station. The historic building always impressed him, a rare constant in the ever-changing city skyline. Without really deciding to, he walked inside, joining the flow of commuters and tourists moving through the massive main concourse. The vaulted ceiling arched overhead, painted with constellations that had guided travelers for generations. Alexander slowed his pace, observing the people around him. Office workers rushing to catch their trains home, tourists taking photos, street performers hoping for tips. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to go, someone waiting for them. Alexander paused near the famous clock in the center of the concourse, watching the constant motion around him. That's when he spotted it, a public piano placed in one corner of the vast space. Part of the city's public art initiative, these pianos appeared in various locations throughout New York, inviting anyone to play. The sight of the piano triggered a flood of memories Alexander had long kept buried. Before tech startups and investment portfolios, before board meetings and billion-dollar acquisitions, there had been music. His mother had noticed his fascination with an old piano at his elementary school when he was just 6 years old. Despite their limited means, she had found a way to pay for lessons, working extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. "Music feeds the soul in ways money never can," she would tell him when he practiced on their second-hand upright piano in their small apartment. Alexander had been considered something of a prodigy, earning a scholarship to a prestigious arts program by age 12. But then came his mother's illness, cancer that moved swiftly and showed no mercy. After she died, music lost its joy. His practical-minded uncle, who became his guardian, had steered him toward computer science and business, fields with real future prospects. Alexander approached the piano slowly, as if drawn by an invisible force. A young woman had just finished playing something light and cheerful, receiving scattered applause from passers-by before hurrying off to catch her train. Now the piano sat unattended, its black and white keys silent and waiting. Alexander glanced around, suddenly self-conscious. No one was paying any attention to him, just another anonymous face in the crowd. He sat down on the bench, setting his phone and wallet beside him. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. It had been years since he'd played seriously, though he still kept a grand piano in his penthouse, more as decoration than instrument. Sometimes, late at night when sleep eluded him, he would play softly, the music a poor substitute for human connection. Alexander placed his fingers on the cool keys, muscle memory taking over as he began to play. He started with something simple, Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece his mother had loved. The notes came hesitantly at first, like a language half forgotten, then with growing confidence as the music flowed through him. A few people slowed their pace, glancing toward the source of the music before continuing on their way. Alexander closed his eyes, letting the familiar melody wash over him. When he finished the piece, he paused, surprised by how natural it had felt, like reconnecting with an old friend, almost without thinking. He transitioned into something different, not a classical piece this time, but a composition of his own. It was something he had started writing after his mother died but never finished, the emotions too raw to fully express. Yet now, in this busy train station surrounded by strangers, the notes came to him as if they had been waiting all these years to be played. The composition began softly, haltingly, like a question without an answer. It spoke of loss and loneliness, of a child's grief too profound for words. As Alexander played, the years seemed to fall away. He was no longer a billionaire tech mogul, but simply a man at a piano, telling his story through music. The melody evolved, growing in complexity and emotion. Alexander lost himself in the performance, unaware that his audience was growing. A businessman checking his watch decided his train could wait. A group of teenagers stopped their chattering to listen. A cleaning worker paused, mop in hand, caught by the unexpected beauty filling the normally hectic space. As the piece progressed, Alexander poured everything into it. The pain of loss, years of isolation despite his success, the emptiness of achievements that couldn't be shared with the one person who had believed in him first. His fingers moved across the keys with increasing urgency, the music swelling to fill the vast space. A toddler broke free from his mother's grasp and wandered closer to the piano, wide-eyed and curious. The child's mother followed, apologetic at first, then transfixed by the performance. She made no move to pull her child away, both of them caught in the spell of the music. Alexander's world narrowed to just the piano and the story he was telling through it. He had forgotten where he was, forgotten the business empire waiting for him outside these walls, forgotten everything but the notes flowing from his fingers. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, truly present in the moment. The composition reached a passage that had always eluded him, the transition from sorrow to acceptance, from loss to healing. In the past, he had always stopped here, unable to find the right progression. But today, in this unexpected place, the notes came to him naturally, a resolution that had been waiting for this moment to reveal itself. Unbeknownst to Alexander, phones were being raised throughout the growing crowd, recording snippets of this extraordinary impromptu performance. A woman wiped away a tear, remembering her own mother. An elderly man closed his eyes, swaying slightly to the music. A young couple held hands tighter, moved by the raw emotion emanating from this stranger at the piano. As Alexander approached the end of his composition, the final notes hovering in the air like a question finally answered, he remained unaware that he had accomplished something his billions never could. He had connected, truly connected, with a group of strangers through nothing but the language of music. The piece ended not with a dramatic flourish, but with a gentle resolution, like a long-held breath finally released. Alexander opened his eyes, the spell broken, reality rushing back. He was startled to find himself surrounded by people, not just a few casual listeners, but a substantial crowd that had formed a circle around the piano. For a moment, there was complete silence, a rare occurrence in bustling Grand Central Station. Then someone began to applaud and others joined in, the sound building until it echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Alexander looked up, meeting the eyes of those nearest to him, ordinary people whose daily commute had been unexpectedly transformed. In their faces, he saw something his wealth and power had never earned him: genuine appreciation, Not for what he owned or controlled, but for what he had created and shared. A heavy feeling in his chest began to lift, a weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. As the applause continued around him, Alexander Hayes, the tycoon no one in the station recognized, felt the first stirrings of what might be joy and the first hints of a road back to himself. The applause gradually faded, but Alexander remained seated at the piano. His fingers still rested lightly on the keys as if unwilling to break the connection that had formed between him and the instrument. People began to disperse, catching trains or continuing their journeys, but many lingered, hoping he might play again. An older gentleman with kind eyes and a weathered face approached the piano. "That was something special," he said, his voice carrying the slight tremor of age. "Haven't heard playing like that in years." Alexander nodded his thanks, unsure how to respond. In the business world, he was known for his sharp tongue and quick responses. But here, in this unexpected moment of vulnerability, words failed him. "Do you play here often?" the older man asked. "No," Alexander replied simply. "First time, actually." "Well, you should come back. Music like that shouldn't stay hidden." The man smiled, touched his hat in a gesture from another era, and walked away. Alexander watched him go, struck by the genuine interaction. No hidden agendas, no attempts to impress or gain favor. When was the last time someone had spoken to him without wanting something? A station announcement echoed overhead, reminding Alexander of the world outside this moment. He should leave, get back to his penthouse, prepare for tomorrow's meetings. Yet he remained seated, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Almost without conscious decision, his hands began moving again. This time he played a piece by Chopin, one of the more challenging works he had mastered in his youth. The music flowed more easily now, his earlier hesitation replaced by growing confidence. A woman stopped to listen, her shopping bag set at her feet. Two teenagers put away their phones, momentarily more interested in the live performance than their screens. A businessman set down his briefcase, checking his watch but making no move to leave. As Alexander played, his thoughts drifted to the board meeting earlier that day. The faces of his executives had been serious as they discussed the restructuring, a clean, clinical word that hid the messiness of real people losing real jobs. He had nodded along, playing his part as the tough but fair CEO. The music grew more intense as his thoughts deepened. What had he become? When had the ambitious young man with dreams of changing the world through technology transformed into someone who could casually approve laying off thousands with a single nod? His playing reflected his inner turmoil, the notes becoming more passionate, more urgent. Chopin gave way to his own improvisation, something raw and unplanned that poured from some long-neglected part of his soul. More people stopped to listen. A circle formed around the piano again, larger than before. Someone began recording on their phone, then another and another, but Alexander noticed none of this. Lost in the conversation between his fingers and the keys, between his present self and the person he had once been. A young woman with a violin case strapped to her back pushed through the growing crowd. She watched intently, her trained ear recognizing something beyond casual playing. This wasn't just some amateur noodling on a public piano, this was artistry. When Alexander paused briefly between movements, she quietly opened her case, removed her violin and began to play along, adding a haunting counter-melody to his composition. Alexander looked up, startled by the new element, then nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Without a word spoken between them, they found a musical rhythm together, as if they had rehearsed for weeks. The violin's voice soared above the piano's foundation, two strangers creating something beautiful in the midst of one of the busiest transit hubs in the world. The crowd grew larger, people pulling others over to witness the impromptu duet. A security guard approached, likely to check if they had permission to perform. But as he got closer, the music caught him too. He stopped, listened for a moment, then stepped back, radio in hand, apparently deciding that some rules could bend for beauty's sake. Alexander felt something unlock inside him as he played with this unknown violinist. The music they created together spoke of loss and rediscovery, of paths not taken and possibilities still waiting to be explored. For years, his identity had been tied to his company, his wealth, his position. Who was he without those things? Here, anonymous in Grand Central Station, he was finding out. The violinist sensed the emotional journey in his playing and matched it. her bow drawing out notes that seemed to answer questions his piano was asking. There was a silent understanding between them, the unique communication that can only happen between musicians fully present in their art. As their improvised piece built toward its conclusion, Alexander became vaguely aware of the unusual silence that had fallen over this section of the station. The normal rush and bustle had temporarily paused as dozens, then hundreds of people stood transfixed by the performance. The final notes hung in the air, piano and violin finishing in perfect harmony. For a heartbeat, complete silence followed, a rare moment of collective stillness in the perpetually moving city. Then came the applause, not the polite acknowledgement from earlier, but an enthusiastic, almost desperate show of appreciation. The violinist smiled at Alexander, a quick professional nod between artists, before packing up her instrument and disappearing into the crowd as suddenly as she had appeared. Alexander watched her go, wishing he could thank her properly for the unexpected collaboration. "That was beautiful," said a voice beside him. A woman in her early 60s stood there, eyes bright with unshed tears. "My husband used to play, before he passed." She clutched a worn leather handbag against her chest. He would have loved this. Alexander didn't know what to say, unaccustomed to such direct emotional connections with strangers. In his world, people rarely shared their vulnerabilities so openly. "Thank you for listening," he finally managed, the words feeling inadequate. "No," she said firmly. "Thank you for playing, for reminding me." She touched his shoulder briefly, then walked away, back straight, head high. More people approached. A young father who had stopped with his daughter on their way home, an art student who wanted to know if he gave lessons, an elderly couple who had danced to one of the pieces in their youth. Each interaction was brief but genuine, connections forming and dissolving in minutes, yet somehow more real than many of the relationships Alexander had maintained for years. As the crowd finally began to thin, a man in his 30s approached. Unlike the others, there was something calculating in his gaze, something that triggered Alexander's business instincts. "That was quite a performance," the man said, extending a hand. "Thomas Wu, I work for the Times. Mind if I ask your name? We're doing a piece on street performers, and what happened here was, well, it was something special." Alexander hesitated, suddenly aware of his vulnerable position. His hoodie and cap had provided anonymity so far, but his face was well known in business circles. One proper look, one photograph in the paper, and his unexpected evening would become a media circus. Billionaire tech CEO moonlights as station pianist. "Just a hobby," Alexander replied, not taking the offered hand. "I'm not a performer." The reporter wasn't easily discouraged. "Those people crying while you played would disagree. Come on, give me something to work with. What's your story?" For a moment, Alexander was tempted to reveal himself, to shed the anonymous shell that had allowed this evening to unfold. How would this hungry young reporter react to discovering he was interviewing one of the richest men in the country? The story would certainly change, no longer about music but about wealth taking a quirky detour. "Everyone has a story," Alexander said finally. "Tonight was about the music, not the player." The reporter looked disappointed but pulled out a business card. "If you change your mind, call me. People connect with stories like yours, talent hiding in plain sight." Alexander took the card automatically, years of networking making the gesture second nature. As the reporter walked away, he looked down at the piano, suddenly aware of how much time had passed. The station had grown quieter, the main rush of commuters gone. He gathered his few belongings, stood up and closed the piano lid gently. Part of him wanted to stay, to continue this unexpected journey, but the practical side of his nature, the side that had built an empire, knew he needed to return to his real life. As Alexander made his way toward the exit, a cleaning worker nodded to him in recognition. "You coming back tomorrow?" the man asked, pausing in his work. "My shift gets pretty boring. Wouldn't mind hearing some more music?" Alexander smiled, the expression feeling unfamiliar on his face. "Maybe," he said, surprising himself with the answer. "Maybe I will." Outside, the night air felt different somehow, the same city but viewed through new eyes. Alexander began walking, bypassing the taxi stand. His penthouse was several miles away, but tonight he wanted to experience the city on foot, to exist in the world as just another person making their way home. As he walked, his mind filled not with tomorrow's meetings or stock projections, but with music. Melodies half remembered, Compositions half-formed, possibilities that had lain dormant for decades. For the first time in years, Alexander Hayes felt a flutter of excitement about waking up the next morning, about what the new day might bring. He pulled his phone from his pocket, meaning to call for his car, then stopped. Instead, he searched for Grand Central Station piano schedule and found himself scrolling through information about the public piano program, wondering when he might return, wondering who else he might become if he dared. Alexander woke early the next morning, something unusual for a man who typically needed 3 alarms and 2 cups of coffee to face the day. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse bedroom, trying to understand the strange lightness he felt. Then he remembered. The piano, the music, the faces of strangers moved by something he had created. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. 17 missed calls, 34 text messages, and over 50 emails had accumulated overnight. The real world was calling, demanding his return. With a sigh, Alexander reached for the device, scrolling through the messages. Most were business-related, urgent matters that couldn't possibly wait, according to the senders. But one text caught his attention. It was from his assistant. "Mr. Hayes, the board is requesting an emergency meeting at 10 a.m. regarding yesterday's restructuring announcement. Several members have expressed concerns about public perception." Public perception. The words made Alexander think of the reporter from last night. Had he been recognized after all? He quickly searched his name online but found only the usual business news. Whatever the board's concerns, they weren't related to his impromptu concert. Alexander showered and dressed in his usual attire: custom suit, designer tie, handmade Italian shoes. The familiar costume of power felt strangely constricting this morning, as if he were playing a role rather than being himself. His driver was waiting downstairs. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," Paul said, opening the car door. "Straight to the office today?" Alexander hesitated. "Actually, let's make a stop first." Grand Central Station. Paul raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. It was not his place to question his employer's directions. The morning rush was in full swing when they arrived at the station. Alexander asked Paul to wait, then entered the massive building alone. He moved against the flow of commuters, many with coffee cups in one hand and phones in the other, eyes focused on screens rather than their surroundings. The main concourse was busier than it had been the previous evening, a constant stream of humanity flowing in all directions. Alexander made his way to the corner where the piano stood, but found it occupied by a young man in a business suit, playing something upbeat while checking his watch between measures. Alexander stood back, watching. After a few minutes, the young man closed the piano lid and hurried off, presumably to catch a train. No one had stopped to listen to his playing. The piano sat empty now, but Alexander made no move toward it. In the harsh light of morning, last night's experience felt like a dream, something that had happened to someone else. What had he been thinking? He was Alexander Hayes, CEO of Hayes Technologies, not some street performer seeking attention from strangers. He turned to leave, to return to the waiting car and the waiting board members and the waiting responsibilities of his real life. But as he did, he nearly collided with an older woman carrying a violin case. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, stepping back. "I wasn't looking where I was going." Alexander recognized her instantly, not the young violinist from last night, but the woman who had spoken to him afterward, the one whose husband had played piano before he passed away. She squinted at him, then her eyes widened slightly. "It's you, the pianist from last night. I almost didn't recognize you in the suit." She smiled, the expression transforming her face. "I was hoping you'd be here again." Alexander felt strangely caught, as if discovered doing something shameful rather than simply standing in a public place. "I was just passing by," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Well, I'm glad you did. My name's Vivian," she said, extending a hand. "I didn't properly introduce myself yesterday." "Alexander," he replied, shaking her hand automatically. "Nice to meet you, Vivian." "I brought something to show you," she said, opening her large handbag and pulling out a small photo in a simple frame. "This is Robert, my husband. He played at Carnegie Hall once, back in 1978. Not as the main act, mind you, but still, Carnegie Hall." Alexander looked at the photo of a smiling man at a piano, his face alight with the joy of playing. Something about the image struck him deeply. the pure happiness captured in that moment untainted by thoughts of status or wealth. He was very good, Vivian continued. Not famous good, but good enough to make people feel something when he played. Like you did last night. I'm sure he was much better than me, Alexander said, feeling strangely humble. Vivian laughed, a warm sound that seemed to cut through the busy noise of the station. Oh, there's no competition in music, young man. Either it touches people or it doesn't. A group of school children filed past them, led by harried-looking teachers trying to keep them in line. Alexander checked his watch, 9:15. The board meeting was in 45 minutes. I should go, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the exit. Of course, Vivian nodded, but then added, Before you do, would you mind playing just one piece? I told my sister about last night, but she didn't believe me when I said how good you were. Alexander looked at the piano, then at his watch again. I'm sorry, I can't right now. I have a meeting. Just one song, Vivian pressed. Something short, please? Perhaps it was the genuine request in her eyes, or perhaps it was his own desire to recapture last night's feeling. But Alexander found himself nodding. One song, he agreed. A short one. They walked to the piano together. Alexander set down his briefcase, removed his suit jacket, and sat on the bench. He flexed his fingers, then began to play. Not a classical piece this time, but a simple, heartfelt melody that had been forming in his mind since the previous night. As before, people began to notice. A few paused in their morning rush, coffee cups halfway to lips, momentarily caught by the unexpected music filling the space. A child broke away from his mother to stand closer, eyes wide with curiosity. Alexander was more aware of his audience this time, not lost in the music as he had been before. He saw the faces, saw the moment when hurry gave way to listening, saw the small smiles and nods of appreciation. Vivian stood nearby, beaming like a proud teacher. When he finished the brief piece, there was a smattering of applause, more subdued than last night but genuine nonetheless. Alexander stood quickly, suddenly self-conscious in his business attire, so clearly out of place at a public piano. That was lovely, Vivian said, touching his arm lightly. Thank you. Alexander nodded, unable to explain the mix of emotions churning inside him. Embarrassment at being so exposed, yet exhilaration at the connections formed through music, however brief. As he gathered his things, a custodian approached, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. Hey, you're back, the man said, recognition in his voice. Thought you might be. People been talking about you all morning. Talking about me? Alexander asked, a note of alarm in his voice. Sure. Videos going around. Someone posted it online last night. You and that violin lady. Got a bunch of views already. Alexander felt his stomach tighten. Video? The custodian pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, then turned the screen toward Alexander. There it was, him in his hoodie and cap playing with the young violinist. The angle was from behind, his face not clearly visible, but it was unmistakably him. The video had over 100,000 views already, with comments scrolling beneath. This is why I love New York. Who are these people? They're amazing. Made me cry on my way to work. Just beautiful. Alexander handed the phone back, his mind racing. He was a private person by nature, his rare public appearances carefully managed by his PR team. The thought of going viral, of becoming an internet sensation, was deeply unsettling. I have to go, he said abruptly, picking up his briefcase. Will you be back tonight? The custodian called after him. Alexander didn't answer, already making his way toward the exit, pulling out his phone to call Paul to bring the car around immediately. As he strode through the station, his phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Board members arriving early. Where are you? Alexander quickened his pace. He needed to get to that meeting, needed to focus on the business empire he had built, needed to stop this strange detour into a world that wasn't his. Yet as he left Grand Central behind, the melody he had just played continued to run through his mind, along with the image of people pausing in their busy days to listen, to connect, to share a moment of beauty in an often harsh world. Paul was waiting with the car. To the office, sir? He asked as Alexander slid into the back seat. Yes, Alexander replied, straightening his tie. And quickly, please. As the car pulled into traffic, Alexander stared out the window, the city blurring past. He was returning to his real life now, to board meetings and spreadsheets, to power lunches and million-dollar decisions. Yet something had changed. Some barrier had broken. Music had crept back into his tightly controlled world, and he wasn't sure he could or wanted to shut it out again. Alexander arrived at the Hayes Technologies headquarters with minutes to spare before the board meeting. His assistant was waiting in the lobby, worry evident on her face. "Mr. Hayes, everyone's already in the conference room," she said, falling into step beside him as he strode toward the elevator. "They've been asking where you are." "I'm right here, Diane," Alexander replied, checking his appearance in the mirrored elevator doors. "And only 5 minutes late." "The world hasn't ended." Diane gave him a curious look. Her boss was typically obsessively punctual, often arriving 30 minutes before scheduled meetings. This casual attitude toward time was new and slightly concerning. "Also," she continued, "there's something you should know before you go in. The press release about the layoffs went out this morning, and the reaction has been stronger than anticipated." Alexander nodded absently, his mind still partly at the piano. "That's to be expected. Restructuring is never popular." "It's more than that, sir," Diane persisted as they entered the elevator. "One of the employees from the Mountain View office posted an emotional video online. It's gone viral. Over 500,000 views already." This caught Alexander's attention. "What kind of video?" "He's a father of 3. His wife has cancer. He talks about how losing his job means losing his health insurance. It's hard to watch, sir." The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. Alexander felt a familiar tension settle between his shoulders. This was what leadership meant: making difficult decisions, bearing the weight of consequences, maintaining course despite emotional appeals. Yet something felt different today. The man's story, a father worried about his family, a husband worried about his sick wife, hit Alexander with unexpected force. Perhaps it was because of his own mother's struggle with cancer, or perhaps it was the remnants of last night's emotional awakening at the piano. Whatever the reason, he couldn't dismiss it as easily as he might have just days ago. The board members rose when Alexander entered the conference room. 8 men and 3 women, all in expensive suits, all with expressions ranging from concern to mild annoyance. "Alexander, glad you could join us," said Richard Westing, the board chairman, with just enough emphasis on could to make his disapproval clear. "Traffic," Alexander said simply, taking his seat at the head of the table. "You wanted to discuss public perception of the restructuring?" For the next hour, Alexander listened as board members debated damage control strategies. The PR team presented slides showing negative social media trends, while the legal department outlined potential risks if the laid-off employees organized class action lawsuits. The financial team reassured everyone that the stock had only dipped slightly, a temporary setback that would reverse once quarterly profits reflected the reduced overhead costs. It was all so clinical, so divorced from human reality. 2,000 jobs translated to numbers on spreadsheets to risk assessments to stock fluctuations. No one mentioned the father with the sick wife, or any of the other human beings whose lives were being upended by the decisions made in this room. "Alexander?" Richard's voice broke through his thoughts. "You've been uncharacteristically quiet. What's your take on all this?" All eyes turned to him, waiting for the decisive leadership he was known for. Alexander straightened in his chair, about to deliver his usual pragmatic response about market realities and shareholder obligations. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he heard himself asking, "Has anyone watched the video? The one with the employee from Mountain View?" The room fell silent. A few board members exchanged glances. "I have," said Westing finally. "Unfortunate situation, but we can't make business decisions based on emotional appeals." "I'd like to see it," Alexander said. The PR director looked surprised but quickly pulled up the video on the large screen at the end of the room. A man in his 30s appeared sitting at what looked like a kitchen table. His eyes red-rimmed but his voice steady as he spoke about his 8 years at Hayes Technologies, about his wife's ongoing cancer treatment, about telling his children they might need to move. When the video ended, the room remained silent. Alexander stood up. "I need some time to think about this," he said. "Let's reconvene tomorrow morning." "Alexander," Westing said sharply, "we need to issue a response today. The markets are watching." "The markets can wait 24 hours, Alexander replied, a new firmness in his voice. Meeting adjourned. He left the stunned board members behind, walking quickly to his private office. Once inside, he closed the door and leaned against it, breathing deeply. What was happening to him? 2 days ago, he would have pushed through that meeting, made decisive calls, put the company first as he always had. But now other voices were breaking through. The violin player at the station, the woman whose husband had played at Carnegie Hall, the father worried about his family's health insurance. Real people with real lives, not just obstacles to profit margins. Alexander moved to his desk where his laptop displayed the company's stock ticker in real time. The numbers were ticking downward. He closed the window and, on impulse, searched for Grand Central Station piano-violin duo. Dozens of videos appeared, the top one with over 300,000 views. He clicked on it and watched himself at the piano, hood up, face mostly hidden, playing with the young violinist. The comment section was filled with positive reactions. This made me cry on my morning commute. I was there. It was even more beautiful in person. Does anyone know who these musicians are? Alexander closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to the window. From his office on the 87th floor, the city stretched out below him, a landscape of buildings and streets that had always represented conquest to him, territory claimed through business acumen and relentless drive. Now, he found himself thinking about the people in those buildings, the individual lives being lived, the struggles and joys he had disconnected from in his rise to the top. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Hayes, your 1 o'clock is here, and Mr. Westing would like a word when you're available." "Cancel my appointments for the rest of the day, Diane," Alexander said, "and tell Richard I'll call him tomorrow." "Sir?" Diane's voice held rare confusion. Alexander never canceled appointments. "Something's come up," he said. "I'll be out of the office for the remainder of the day." Without waiting for a response, Alexander grabbed his coat and headed for the elevator. He nodded to surprised employees as he passed, people who rarely saw the CEO walking the regular corridors of the building. In the lobby, he bypassed his waiting driver and walked out onto the street. The October air was crisp, carrying the first hints of the coming winter. Alexander hailed a taxi. "Grand Central Station, please," he told the driver. The station was less crowded in the early afternoon, the morning rush long over and the evening commute not yet begun. Alexander made his way to the piano, relieved to find it unoccupied. He sat down, not bothering to remove his suit jacket this time. Who was he hiding from, really? What would happen if people knew that Alexander Hayes, tech billionaire, played piano in a train station? His fingers found the keys and he began to play. Not a classical piece or a structured composition, but a raw emotional improvisation that reflected the turmoil within him. The melody spoke of doubt and questioning, of old certainties crumbling and new possibilities emerging. Gradually, people began to gather. A group of tourists stopped their sightseeing to listen. An off-duty police officer leaned against a pillar, coffee in hand. 2 businesswomen set down their briefcases. Alexander played on, barely noticing as the crowd grew. His mind was working through problems not of music but of conscience. The man from Mountain View, the employees whose lives would be devastated by his restructuring, the increasing disconnect between his company's stated values and its actions. All of it swirled through his thoughts as his fingers moved across the keys. When he finally stopped, the applause startled him back to awareness. The crowd had grown substantial, filling the corner of the station with people who had paused their journeys to listen. As they dispersed, a young man approached the piano. Alexander recognized him instantly, the reporter from the Times. "I thought I might find you here," Thomas Wu said, smiling. "Though I didn't expect the suit. You clean up well for a station pianist." Alexander didn't return the smile. "Just enjoying some time at the piano," he said, preparing to leave. "I did some digging after we spoke last night," the reporter continued, stepping closer. "Watch the videos that are going around. Something about your playing seemed familiar. So I compared it with some old footage I found. Yale University, 1991. A piano recital by a promising young musician named Alexander Hayes." Alexander felt his heart rate increase. "What do you want?" "An interview," Thomas said simply. The full story. Tech billionaire Alexander Hayes, secretly playing piano in Grand Central Station while his company announces massive layoffs. "It writes itself. It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," Thomas pressed. "Because right now it looks like a man living a double life. Ruthless CEO by day, soulful pianist by night. People would eat that up." Alexander stood up from the piano bench. There's no story here. There's always a story, Mr. Hayes. The question is who gets to tell it. Thomas handed him another business card. Think about it. I can be reached any time. As the reporter walked away, Alexander remained by the piano, the business card heavy in his hand. His carefully constructed world was beginning to crack, lines blurring between who he was and who he had become. His phone buzzed. Another text from Westing. The board is considering an emergency session without you if you continue to be unavailable. This is unprecedented, Alexander. Alexander put the phone away without responding. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't sure what his next move should be. The clear path of ambition and success that had guided him for decades now seemed to fork in unexpected directions, and the choice ahead was anything but simple. Alexander stood in the grand entrance hall of his penthouse apartment, staring at the baby grand piano that occupied the corner by the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had purchased the instrument years ago, a status symbol more than anything else, something elegant to fill the space and impress the rare visitors he entertained. Now he approached it with newfound reverence, running his fingers lightly over the polished surface. Unlike the worn public piano at Grand Central, this one was pristine, barely played. Alexander lifted the cover and sat down, feeling the familiar weight of decision settling over him. His phone had been buzzing non-stop since he left the office. 17 missed calls from board members, 32 text messages, 5 voicemails, each more urgent than the last. The business empire he had built was demanding his return, his attention, his leadership. But as he placed his fingers on the keys and began to play, those demands seemed to recede. The music that flowed from his hands felt more honest, more real than anything he had done in years. It wasn't perfect. He was rusty from decades of neglect. But it was genuine in a way his corporate persona had not been for a long time. He played for nearly an hour, losing himself in the process before a soft knock at the door interrupted him. He paused, annoyed at the intrusion, until he remembered he had asked his driver to return with something. Paul stood in the doorway, holding a small stack of manila folders. "The files you requested, sir," he said, handing them over. "Thank you, Paul," Alexander replied. "That will be all for tonight." When his driver had gone, Alexander opened the first folder. Inside were printouts of employee files, the 2,000 people scheduled to lose their jobs in the restructuring, names, photos, years of service, performance reviews. Real people with real lives reduced to paperwork and spreadsheet entries. Alexander read through file after file, his chest growing heavier with each story that emerged. The father from the viral video was there. 8 years of exemplary service, 3 children, a wife battling stage 3 breast cancer. But there were hundreds of other stories too, equally compelling, equally human. A single mother, who had worked her way up from the call center to team leader. 58-year-old programmer who might never find another job in a youth-obsessed industry. A brilliant engineer whose project had been cut despite its promise, simply because it wasn't immediately profitable. As the night deepened, Alexander moved from the files to his laptop, researching alternatives, running numbers, creating new projections. The businessman in him wrestled with the newly awakened human, searching for a path that might satisfy both. Dawn was breaking when he finally stood, stiff from hours of focused work, and walked to the window. The city was coming alive below him, millions of people starting their day, each with their own struggles and dreams. Somewhere among them was the young violinist, the kind-eyed Vivian, the custodian who had recognized him, the reporter who had discovered his secret. Alexander showered and dressed with unusual care, selecting a suit he rarely wore, navy blue rather than his usual gray or black. He wouldn't be hiding today, not from himself and not from the world. "Take me to the office, Paul," he said when he reached the car. The Hayes Technologies building was already humming with activity when Alexander arrived. Employees glanced at him with surprise. The CEO typically arrived later, after most of them were settled into their workday. "Gather the board," he told Diane as he passed her desk, "and set up the conference room for a video call with all regional offices. I want everyone to be able to watch." "Everyone?" Diane repeated, clearly confused. "Everyone," Alexander confirmed. "All employees at all locations." The board members assembled quickly, their faces showing varying degrees of concern and irritation. Richard Westing was the first to speak. Alexander, what is the meaning of this? We've been trying to reach you for 18 hours. I've been working. Alexander replied simply, taking his seat at the head of the table. And I've come to some decisions. About the viral video? The PR team has drafted a response. This isn't about PR, Alexander cut in. This is about who we are as a company, and who I am as a leader. He looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes. I've decided to cancel the restructuring. A stunned silence fell over the room, broken by nervous laughter from one of the newer board members. You can't be serious. The projections, the overhead costs. I've run new projections, Alexander said, sliding folders across the table. We can absorb the cost by reducing executive bonuses, starting with mine. I'm cutting my own compensation package by 80%. The laughter died abruptly. Westing's face reddened. That's completely unacceptable. The board won't approve this. Actually, they don't need to, Alexander replied calmly. Executive compensation is ultimately my decision as CEO. But the restructuring does require board approval, which is why I've called you all here. He opened his laptop, bringing up a presentation on the large screen at the end of the room. These are my new proposals. A refocusing rather than a restructuring. We invest more in our people, not less. We bring back some of the innovative projects we shelved because they weren't immediately profitable. We take a longer view. For the next 30 minutes, Alexander outlined his vision with the same precision and passion he had once reserved for profit strategies. Some board members looked skeptical, others intrigued. When he finished, Westing leaned forward. This is all very idealistic, Alexander, but the shareholders will receive a personal message from me, along with everyone else, Alexander said, glancing at his watch. The company-wide video call begins in 5 minutes. I'd like you all to join me in the main conference room. Without waiting for a response, Alexander stood and walked out, leaving the bewildered board members to follow. The main conference room was set up with cameras and lighting, the tech team making final adjustments. We're live in 3 minutes, Mr. Hayes, the communications director said. All offices are connected and waiting. Alexander nodded, feeling a strange calm descend over him. Thousands of employees worldwide would be watching, including the 2,000 who had been told their jobs were ending, including the father with the sick wife, including people who knew him only as a distant figure, a name on company-wide emails, a face in the annual report. 30 seconds, the tech director called. Alexander straightened his tie and faced the camera. The red light blinked on and he began to speak. Good morning. This is Alexander Hayes. Many of you know me only as the CEO, a title that has sometimes created distance between us. Today I want to bridge that distance and speak to you directly, person to person, he continued, explaining his decision to cancel the layoffs, outlining the new direction for the company, acknowledging past mistakes. As he spoke, he could see on the monitors that employees in offices around the world were reacting with surprise, relief, and in some cases, tears. This decision wasn't easy, Alexander admitted. The business logic behind the restructuring was sound, but we are more than balance sheets and profit margins. We are people, working together to build something meaningful. He paused, then added, Some of you may have seen videos circulating online recently, showing a man playing piano at Grand Central Station. That man was me. A murmur ran through the room. On the monitors, employees leaned closer to their screens. Music was my first love, before business, before technology, Alexander continued. I had forgotten that until very recently. I had forgotten many things that matter. I'm still the CEO of this company, but I hope to be a different kind of leader going forward. One who remembers that our work has meaning beyond quarterly reports. Who sees you as people first and employees second. When the broadcast ended, there was a moment of absolute silence in the conference room. Then Richard Westing stepped forward. That was quite a performance, he said, his voice tight. But this isn't over, Alexander. The board will need to discuss these changes. Of course, Alexander agreed. But not today. Today I have somewhere else to be. He left the stunned board members behind, taking the elevator to the lobby and stepping out into the crisp autumn air. His phone was already buzzing with notifications. The broadcast was generating waves of reaction, both internally and in the wider business world. But Alexander wasn't heading to another meeting or a press conference. Instead, he directed his driver to Grand Central Station. The main concourse was busy with mid-morning travelers. Alexander made his way to the piano, which was currently being played by a teenage girl while her friends recorded on their phones. He waited patiently until she finished, then approached as she gathered her things. "That was beautiful," he said sincerely. The girl smiled shyly. "Thanks, I'm just learning." "Keep at it," Alexander encouraged her. "Music has a power nothing else does." When she left, Alexander sat down at the piano. Without hesitation, he began to play, not hiding this time, not anonymous in a hoodie and cap, but fully present as himself. The melody that emerged was joyful, hopeful, speaking of new beginnings and rediscovered purpose. People began to gather, first a few, then dozens. Someone recognized him. He heard his name whispered through the crowd. Phones appeared, recording the unexpected sight of a well-known CEO playing piano in the middle of a busy station. Alexander didn't mind. The music flowing from his fingers told his truth more honestly than words ever could. In the faces around him, strangers connecting through a shared moment of beauty, he found something his wealth and power had never given him: a genuine human connection. As the final notes hung in the air, Alexander noticed Thomas Wu, the reporter, standing at the edge of the crowd. Their eyes met, and Alexander nodded slightly. There was a story here after all, one worth telling. The applause that followed seemed to echo beyond the station walls, into a future Alexander couldn't fully see yet but was finally ready to embrace. One note, one day, one human connection at a time.